All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today on Ask Me Anything. For PCI. So as you can understand, this is an Ask Me Anything. Everything will be question driven. We're not going to have any slides or anything like that. So certainly feel free. We already have quite a few questions that have come up. I even have a couple of my own. So feel free to put your questions in, typically in the Q&A section. We'll look to get to them there. Or if the chat works for you as well, we'll be monitoring both. So first off, my name is Stephen Marshwitz, Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec. I'd like to welcome Justin Leapline, who is our PCI Practice Lead.
Morning, afternoon.
Thanks for joining us,
Yeah,
braving rain, sleet, snow, dark of night.
Coronavirus,
everything coming in. Really appreciate you being here and everyone else joining. So just a quick background on TrustedSec. Again, we're we'd say a full service security consulting firm. We handle everything from, of course, penetration testing to compliance, program building, pretty much any framework from a security perspective that you've heard of, as well as remediation. So we've brought that on in the last year or so, and that's really taken off, especially with all the little things that people need to have to be able to get compliant or secure. There's tons of little things. And now even with this PCI, what's so great about this is there's so much going on and so much change. It's always difficult to keep up. Yep. And then lastly, we have incident response, which is, again, been very, very popular lately.
Like leaps and bounds over the last year.
It really has. There's just been a ton of incidents, from small ones to big ones, but all over the board. So one of the things that we really do and we pride ourselves on that's pretty different is we have a fully dedicated research team for attacks and exploits. And what that allows us to do is really bring you the latest and greatest hacking techniques, exploit techniques from what a nation state would give you. So without that, it's really a challenge. We've talked to some of our practice leads on that, of what that's helped and the help that it's brought to all of our practices to make sure that we're giving you the best information possible. And then we flow that out through all of our different practices and bring that to you too. So feel free always. We always say, if you have any questions, feel free to email us or call us anytime. We're always willing to help. So with that, Justin, give us a little quick background about yourself.
Yep, sure thing. So Justin Leapline, I've been involved in the security industry probably full-time since 2004, I think it was. Prior to that, I've been software development, configuration management, system deployment, things of that nature. Since then, I've been, I ran the governance program for Diebold. Before joining TrustedSec, I was actually director of security for giftcards.com, which was the largest e-commerce in Pittsburgh at that time there. And been involved heavily with the PCI topic at hand here, from different entities of being card production, acquirer, issuer, all over the place, service provider, that really been able, this is my second go around for being a QSA. So there's a lot of different nuance, but one of the things that we bring to the team is just our wealth of experience and just helping customers kind of understand, especially when it comes to like scoping and things of that nature, how to relay that and the PCI standards back into their environment and understand what the controls actually mean. So
fantastic. Yeah, Justin really knows a ton about this stuff, more than anyone that I've ever met. So
if I don't know it, I'll make it up.
That's right, I'll make it up. All right, we will get started already with, we already have a couple questions, so thanks very much. So the first one, what's the best, and probably an easier one, what's the best place to start learning about how to become a provider of PCI compliance audits, assessments, what you have to go through, that type of thing? Yeah,
so first off is obviously the PCI Council. They have a wealth of information, from guidance documents to SLITs to everything under the sun, from that. So that's first up, and they're the arbiters of what is or is not compliant and some of the interpretations. One of the things I always go to when I get kind of off the wall questions and everything is go to their FAQ section, which they've addressed a lot of different gray areas into it, to scoping, segmentation, is VoIP considered a transmission of cardholder data, all those little things. They're nuggets of information that from the council's perspective, you get an insight and oftentimes what they're looking at. Sometimes they leave it in a gray area, sometimes on purpose, sometimes just to not make a wave through the industry. But that would be first step. Other than that, there's a lot of great resources online. There's a lot of good bloggers out there. PCI Guru is one that's good from information. And also there's a number of LinkedIn places that have forums and PCI network and all that stuff that are good for questions popping up. So that's another place I always check to look for some guidance on it. Take it with a grain of salt. You know, obviously you got a lot of people responding to that.
So I'll start with one that I struggle with now is what constitutes proper segmentation?
Yep.
There's so much has changed and it still keeps coming up. And even when we do penetration tests, we see lots of times where they're still breaking into PCI networks that were supposedly segmented. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, so the first place to go for defining segmentation is actually the top of the data security standard. So there's a section dedicated to scoping and segmentation that they lay out exactly the types of assets that they consider. It's important to understand with PCI, I really break it down. There's two types of assets within PCI scope. There's the cardholder data environment. These are the assets that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. These are the ones that bleed scope. The other one is a system component, critical system component. They refer to it a couple times through the DSS, but these are ones that could have an impact to the security of the cardholder data environment. A common example of that is Active Directory. You know, so providing authentication, but never touching cardholder data. Those are also into scope with that. The two main difference with it, one bleeds scope, one doesn't bleed scope with it. So your segmentation and access control should be all around those cardholder data environment, the ones that touch cardholder data. The other ones, it's kind of a gray area with PCI. They have a guidance document that they published 3-4 years ago or something like that. They do include some type of supportive networks into that, but the way it's actually defined in the DSS is that the CDE bleed scope and the other systems don't with that. Now, they define segmentation as doing ingress, egress filtering down to business justified roles. When we go through and we actually review those ACLs for that proper segmentation, we're looking for that every rule has a definition somewhere. It could be in your change ticket that we have to pull. It could be right in line with the ACLs, but we're looking for that justification. We're looking for insecure ports and services being allowed. Those are, you know, things that will draw questions. And we also look for reasonableness. So, you know, if you have basically everything above 1024 as open services from a port perspective, we're going to question that. Why is that so, you know, broad with that, you know, type of thing? If there's large ranges or you allow any IP address from this one network, we start then diving into questions. Is that truly business justified? Or is there really just one server coming from that and it's not tight enough? So those are the things that draw from a proper segmentation to that.
Anything around then cloud, container, payment applications, any of that like changes making a difference to the segmentation?
Yeah, I mean, that thought process that I just laid out applies to all of them. Where that comes down into play is who's responsible for what, you know, type of thing. So when you go into a third party, you have to have a clear understanding. In fact, one of the requirements in 12.8 is aligning what your service provider is doing from a PCI perspective versus what you're still doing from a PCI perspective. So a good example of that is, you know, from, you know, you're outsourcing like a Salesforce website and everything. Okay, who's doing the penetration test? You know, somebody needs to be doing that, whether it's on you, whether it's them, maybe it's shared, you know, type of thing. Like they're still doing their infrastructure, but they're never going to touch your app. It's good to understand those kind of delineation points. And then from a QSA perspective, we have a clear understanding of what we need to measure. Okay, what type of documentation did you collect to make sure that they're doing X, Y, and Z controls? And you're doing A, B, and C controls, and we'll gather evidence from you for that perspective. But the biggest thing that, you know, customers often just don't do adequate is actually define who's doing what and what that relationship is like, type of thing.
So is there a document they put together
Yep.
or something? Okay.
Yeah,
To
so
show evidence?
depending on how mature the third party is, like the AWS, the Google Cloud, the Azure's, they have a responsibility matrix. Like AWS is big on the shared responsibility. If you ever go to a conference with them, they'll break it down like, hey, this isn't all us, this is you too, type of thing. So if you screw up an ACL on an S3 bucket and open it up to the world where you're storing cardholder data, that's not on us, type of thing. And they lay out the document actually broken up by requirement and by their services, on who's responsible for what. So a good example, if I'm launching up an EC2 VM instance, you're still responsible for baselines, you're responsible for authentication, you're responsible for all those controls that would come up through PCI. If you're using a serverless Lambda type function, you're just uploading code and it's running. There is no, accounts on the server that you're doing. It might be in the application, but on the server side, baselines, things of that nature, vulnerability management from the infrastructure, that's now all on AWS's shoulders. And they say, yep, we got this. You don't have to worry about it. You have to worry about your application, obviously, but the infrastructure is all that. Yep.
Gotcha. All right. Heavy hitter, big one. Can you briefly state the newer controls related to the PCI DSS 4.0 standard?
Yeah, briefly. Yeah,
I don't know if you can briefly.
Yeah. And actually, we did a webinar on this, so we got a little bit more in depth. So definitely go check that out, where we kind of dive into it. But there are a number of things that they're adding on and kind of doing that. Most of the controls they're adding on isn't too impactful type of thing. So there's little things of like a perfect example. If you have point of sale terminals, it's already a requirement that you have to periodically inspect those terminals for signs of malicious or, a substitute type equipment onto it. Now they put in a control and say, well, you got to define what periodically is, which we've been advising clients, forever, because we have to measure on what you're saying periodic is. So now that's a requirement. You got to define it.
And when does it come out again?
So end of this year, beginning of next. They haven't had a hard timeline, but at the council meeting last year, that was their estimate of what they did.
And so it's not finalized. This is
Yep. So they had one round of requests for comments back in December. They said they're going to have another round here about midsummer, like June timeframe. And then they'll come out with the draft and, finalization toward the end of the year or beginning of next. It really, they said, it depends on how many comments they get back and how much heartburn everybody's, talking about, how much they have to adjust. The biggest difference is that it's a fundamental change on how they've done it since the start, type of thing. So typically you'd had all your requirements. If you couldn't meet the requirement directly, you had a compensating control that basically you would have to declare the limitation, financial, business, whatever that may be, technical, you couldn't do. And then you had to write up basically, here's what we're doing to go over and above the controls. Here's how we're monitoring for it, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're making it more flexible that any single control, you don't even have to have an underlying, like, I don't think this, I can't do it this way. You can actually just come up with your own test plan on the controls if you think it's meeting the intent of the control. And PCI is now defining all the intent of the controls. So if you come across and say, AV, has to be scanning and all that stuff and everything. But, the new best of breed AV solution doesn't do any scanning or signatures. It's all behavioral based. And you think that meets the intent of it, you can, write up a test plan for how, to actually get that and then, put it into place.
But wouldn't that leave it a little bit more, I guess, up to chance or up to interpretation by the QSA?
Yep. So it would definitely be up to the QSA whether it meets the intent type of thing. And it's yet to be kind of fleshed out, but you have to write up a test plan for it. If it's a QSA writing up the test plan for it, obviously we would have to account for that, like our time, with that. If it's the client writing up the test plan, we would have to actually validate it. Much like the PCI is today, like the merchant or service provider sets the scope and the controls, QSA validates, type of thing. So when they're doing their controls and checks and everything, we're not coming in and telling like it has to be this way. We're validating what they've not done, and whether that meets the intent of it, type of thing. And we can give guidance and help that out, but largely it's up to the merchant to define what their environment looks like from a control perspective. Other things that they've kind of minorly did, that they were looking at removing you could actually transmit cardholder data encrypted or unencrypted across a trusted network, so your own network,
Sure.
Type of thing. They said at the conference that they're going to make it that it has to be encrypted no matter where it's transmitted, which most clients are already doing. There might be some problematic points, like some clients, they'll terminate the SSL TLS connection at a load balancer. Sometimes they won't re-encrypt to the web server type of thing, because then that's another set of certificates, and quite honestly that doesn't give them a scoping benefit, because the load balancer's in scope, the web server's in scope, those networks are in scope. So there might be some points that will have to be addressed through that, but other than that, it's not too bad. So
anything else on the big things, or that
No.
could be potentials, or
yeah, I mean, that's
that you see that you were thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of controls that they're adding. Just keep in mind that it's going to be years, until that's actually put in place, because anything that they're changing from a fundamental perspective, they typically forward date to another year or two after it's released. So we're looking at 2021, 2022 for these controls to actually be put in place. Plus, with how they're actually rewriting basically the DSS to be more intent driven, and flexible to do your own stuff. If you can't meet some of the new controls, they can write up their own test plan to say, yes, we think we're meeting the intent, and here's why, type of thing, and here's how to test it. So there'll be a lot of more flexibility. I'm not sure how much that will be used, type of thing. I think out of the gate, most people will just go through the normal standard controls. But as time goes on, we'll see probably a few, I call them compensating controls, but they're customized controls with that utilize it with different stuff. Because one of the times, and PCI is probably the best at this, but every standard regulation out there, they're always behind on the times, type of thing. So new tool, new environment, new cloud offering, type of thing. New security tools are coming out, how does that fit into my previous regulatory or compliance standard? It's hard to address that, type of thing. So this will offer way more flexibility, like work from home. Perfect example with like the coronavirus. And we've had a number of clients ask us like, hey, how do I want to put my customer support people at home, but what about the physical controls with PCI and required to be around a sensitive area, type of thing. So, this will allow you a little bit more flexibility without the standard saying, here's the parameters, type of thing.
So what is the answer to that?
Yeah.
So at home.
Yeah. So the logical side, that's pretty straightforward. As long as you're using company-owned equipment, controlled, everything along that lines, you can get that to work. The physical side is where it kind of gets a little bit more challenging, because requirement 9.1 through 9.4 is all about physical control. So you need access control and or video cameras. You need visitor controls, of badge and all that. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't apply, type of thing. What we've done for customers is we basically help them kind of craft a policy to say, you need to have an isolated space. It needs to be locked during business operations. There can be no other people in that room while you're taking calls, with this. Writing cardholder information down, et cetera, type of thing. We even talked about like before the employee would be allowed to do that, taking a picture that they do have an isolated space and everything. Basically, the biggest concern is that they have a dedicated workspace. Like if you have roommates or something like that, and you're out on the kitchen table taking calls, for payment and everything, that's not appropriate, type of thing. But I think we crafted a good kind of intent, and really, for that aspect there, I think it works out well. Now with the new 4.0, like I said, it will offer a little bit more flexibility that for those access controls, you could actually write up that, yeah, I think that meets the intent.
Gotcha. So. Okay, great. There's a lot there. What are the main differences from a control perspective between a lock and an SAQD? I'm only aware that a QSA needs to sign a ROC.
Yes, and that is correct, that the QSA only needs to sign a report on compliance. The SAQ, there are spots where a QSA can sign, and you basically have to dictate what your kind of activities are in helping out. So sometimes it's just guidance.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that we do for customers all the time where we'll actually perform kind of a ROC light. We'll gather evidence, we'll do a sampling perspective of what servers and systems and everything else that would be under that. And we'll fill out the SAQ and we'll, say we've done everything, we tested everything, and here's our signature to say, like, we back this up. A lot of customers like that kind of validation and comfort. Sometimes it's not really required. The kind of edge case is that MasterCard for level 2s have required that you either need to get a QSA to do it, or an ISA, an internal security assessor, basically somebody that goes to a PCI class for 2 days and takes a test, type of thing. So in those kind of edge cases, and it's really up to the bank on whether they force a ROC or an SAQ. That's where we kind of rely on the bank that's asking them for their attestation. Most of the time they'll do an SAQ, no problem. But, we'll come in, and the reporting aspect is way easier, from an SAQ. So for the ROC, every single requirement that we're filling out, we have to put comments to. What document did we read? Who did we talk to? Describe the control environment. How do we, what did we see within the document that showed this? What evidence did we look at? All that stuff is spelled out within a report of compliance. For an SAQ, we have those notes on the back end, but the actual reporting is a checkbox in place, type of thing. So we don't have to do as thorough of a job to what we produce for a ROC than we do for an SAQ. So.
Okay, great. Tokenization. What is the best practice PCI guidance in terms of cardholder information that needs to be tokenized? Is it only PAN or PAN plus CVV plus expiry date press practice? How does that work?
Yeah. So the standard is just the PAN and everything. You should not be storing CVV at all post authorization. That's actually a requirement within PCI there. And quite honestly, the CVV is only to prove that's a valid card. If people don't know, the CVV2 number, which is basically the card not present CVV number, that's stored by the issuer. It's a random 3 or 4 digit number that the issuer of the card holds on to. And when you do kind of a transaction, let's say card not present, I'm on Amazon, and I type in my card, there's a spot for the CVV. It helps in kind of checking from a fraud perspective, because that should not be stored anywhere on any merchant systems, type of thing. Right. But once you kind of type that in, it goes through, where it's flown through the card networks, Visa, MasterCard, or going over like a debit card network. It goes back to the issuer and says, does this number match up with this card, type of thing. It'll come back and say, yes, it is. Once you have that, it's a valid card, type of thing. So you can tokenize the PAN, already knowing that it's a valid card. If that information doesn't change, you don't have to revalidate it every single time. With the expiration date, really, I mean, it's only 3 years ahead of time. So there's only 36 options, that could be, that doesn't even need to be encrypted by PCI. You can't store it. And you should store it, because that's actually the 2 attributes that are needed with it, with that there. So.
Gotcha. Does Carbon Black Protect and High Enforcement meet the AV requirement of PCI? So maybe it's back to the intent. AV is a blacklist, which CBP also maintains. You know anything about Carbon Black Protect? Yeah,
I mean, we've assessed a number of clients with that. I'd have to look back at the specifics with it, but we do with environments, Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, we have certified that they are meeting, the requirements to look at malware within the environment and flagging on that and blocking it. So it's a definite possibility, but the devil's in the details, type of thing. So we look at, capabilities, what you have employed, all that stuff, and then measure it back to the requirements with that. So a definite maybe.
Gotcha. Okay, and we had actually a good webinar on this. If you're reviewing or testing code, how thorough are you expected to be? It's always possible to test more or to think of new potential issues. but you have to stop somewhere. What's the
Yep.
best practice guidance?
Yeah, so it really comes down to I always advocate for a layered approach to this. So first and foremost, big fan of peer reviews, having some coding standard that you're going back, incorporating security into the libraries that you use. So for example, if you're dealing with web requests, having a sanitization type thing, if you're redisplaying out, that it's filtering, coming in, sanitizing, going out, all that stuff. Having that built into the code is awesome. If that's there by default and you have to override it to do different stuff, it's a lot easier for the coder not to make a mistake. Obviously, when you're submitting like a pull request and putting in new code or changes into that, having those peer reviews and ensure that you're following company best practices, you're relating it back to your security SDLC type of things, then incorporating security checks along the way. In the cloud environment, one of the things we say is like making sure your dependencies are updated. It's not just your code, it's also everybody else's code you're using on the platform. So making sure you have the latest and greatest, and any security vulnerabilities have been found in those packages, using a static analysis scanner, typically built into your pipeline, which is really nice, type of thing. Some are even incorporating it into their IDE specifically,
right.
So before they even do a pull request, they're seeing if there's any issues that they need to correct right there, then and there. And then at the kind of last layer is still doing scans, that incorporate common web vulnerabilities. If you have a big application, I'd recommend getting a team to look at it at least once a year and after any like big changes. So if you're messing around with authentication, hey, maybe we should get, extra eyes to make sure that we're not screwing this up, type of thing. And also to a web application firewall, into there. And these are all kind of layers. Now, how to best play that into your environment, that's where it kind of looks into it, because you don't want to slow down developers, but you also want to make sure that a slip up of the code does not, constitute SQL injection, type of thing.
But that would be from a PCI perspective or from a QSA perspective. Like, what's the line that would be caught? Like SQL injection would be caught, or like what's the?
I mean, it all depends. Yeah, so it all depends. I mean, all these are hopefully that it will be caught. I mean, through peer review, maybe it'll be caught that they're not, they're just taking user input and putting it directly into a SQL statement. You should be parameterizing your environment variables, but sometimes that's not possible depending on the technology. That's where, other stuff of static analysis tools, actual testing, all that stuff is like layers to help you avoid those big bugs and everything. And one thing I didn't mention is in my last organization, we actually rolled out a bug bounty program, which was really nice because, we just pay on valid things and everything. And there were some doozies of bugs, came out in some of our legacy code that we found out, and through some third-party stuff that were very pertinent, and we gladly paid out stuff. I think our top was $5,000, and we paid that out once or twice, type of thing. So, and I mean, the reverse of that, if that got out and somebody actually used that from a malicious standpoint, how many hours are you going to sunk into reporting that out and all that stuff? So that's very valuable as well. So,
gotcha. A long one. P2PE, SAQ, AOC. Most of what we do now maps to what is required to test per P2PE, but have a few fringe items that we're hoping to can be addressed with that context. For example, we have a call center and phone calls are recorded. Part of the verbal exchange in a call may involve sharing of credit card info, example, to book a service. Call recording is muted automatically when the call center rep enters the field to enter credit card information. Having said that, we run a control to check the percentage of recordings to confirm that the mute function is working, that type of thing. So how does something like that affect our status specific to being able to attest to P2PE? Are we overthinking it?
Yep. So yeah, the way I kind of take the scenario is I'm assuming that the swipe terminal is actually sitting on the customer service desk with that, and that's the P2P solution that they're using with it. Keep in mind, the P2P is more geared to actually doing card present transactions and card not present, because VoIP is still in scope. if you're using VoIP, and that recording software, if you're storing any, which it sounds like they're trying to avoid, actually storing any card data. But if you store any, you're instantly to an SAQD, type of thing. That's any other version. If you store it once, it goes to that, type of thing. In that case, what I would do is a lot of times it's just up to your bank on how to report. So if you go to your through your account rep to the compliance manager and say, hey, we're basically P2P, but it's kind of an edge case here, type of thing. Can we still fill out P2P? They're the arbiters of your compliance efforts. So if they say, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense to me, all you have to do is fill out P2P. Great, get that in writing, through an email or,
right.
summarize.
And they can show that to you as a QSA, for example.
Yeah, but I mean, in us, it's not up to us, from that. Again, the merchant kind of sets it, the bank dictates, merchant sets it, we validate, type of thing. But if their bank is telling them like, this is all we want, type of thing, then that's what they want. We had even one case, I think it was last year, that the bank came down, we did a full-blown ROC. The bank came down and said, here are the controls. I've never seen this before, but they came down and said, here are the controls we're interested for you to certify. Now, we went to the merchant and said, we'd probably add some more controls in, if we were actually doing this, but your bank is saying this, we'll test to those controls, type of thing. And we put in the comments when it was not applicable, say, per their bank, this is, right. Out of scope and everything. So we covered ourselves, from that. But at the end of the day, that report goes to the bank, type of thing. And if they're happy with that, we're going to test the controls that were in scope to, what we do normally. But, if their bank was happy with that, we're happy, client's happy, type of thing. So
great. What is Trusted Sec's best practice for credit card data migrations? Are there any key features or critical elements that should be included?
Yeah. So yeah, if you're going and moving like from different data stores, or, a lot of times what we'll see is people doing going from like an actual storing cardholder data to tokenization and how to do that migration there. Honestly, there is no best practices into that. What I truly recommend is just ensuring, one, that you're doing it within a secure environment. Obviously, you're going to have to decrypt cardholder data, whether that's just in memory, whether that's a temporary data store, whatever that may be. You just need to ensure that it is kept secure, for that interim time being. Honestly, largely PCI is a point in time assessment, type of thing. So there are a number of controls that will check historically and whether you've been doing it all throughout the year. But honestly, we care about today, type of thing. So there are a number of times if you've missed target compliance dates or, tasks that you had to do in the past, we're basically just looking at, all right, how are you going to avoid this in the future, mark it and move on, as long as it's compliant today when we sign. So even at that interim, technically, if you have to decrypt cardholder data, okay, it might be non-compliant right now, type of thing. But if it's only for an hour or two while you're doing data migration, type of thing, that's not, a huge deal, type of thing. I'll give you a great example. When we were at gift cards, we had an encryption solution over our MariaDB environment. And we stored cardholder data, obviously giftcards.com. We even were a program manager with that. Come to find out, after using this new solution for 6 months, 5 months, we were seeing some data integrity issues all through, very hard to pinpoint. Came down that it was actually the encryption solution that was on this database. And of course, it was right before we had to be compliant, like weeks before we had to be compliant. And we did a rush, type of thing. But we, as a, they came to me as a, the head of security. They're like, what do we do, from this point? And I made the call of like, yeah, we need to take it off. We're not going to sacrifice data integrity, type of thing. And it's, still stored in a highly protected database, type of thing. But in an interim, we were unencrypted, and then we moved, to a new solution, and we were a little bit late. Communicated with the bank, said, hey, we had integrity issues with our encryption. Here's our game plan. We'll be up. And I think it took us a month and a half to get a new solution in place, that was happy.
Gotcha. So. Okay, great. Under the requirement of 1.2, an untrusted network, is any network, an untrusted network is any network that is external to the networks belonging to the entity under review and or which is out of the entity's ability to control or manage. If I understand correctly, This would also apply to ISP managed private WAN, EVPN, MPLS, etc., and therefore require a firewall. Is that true?
So yeah, so the firewall is actually an interesting question. There's actually an FAQ of whether your ISP is actually within scope of PCI. First and foremost, you should be encrypting, type of thing. If you're going over some type of link, it's just safer to encrypt that either at the data layer, actually encrypt the packets, or wrap it under TLS or IPsec tunnel or something like that. But if you can't do that, and it's like a direct line, the council have been including more and more into those. That is saying that it's not a private line. They have an exclusion for that, but they recently roped in, I say recently, like 4 or 5 years ago, that satellite SATCOM information was at one time considered a private link. Now they consider that an untrusted, type of thing, and it should be encrypted. So, it's always safer to encrypt. But in those cases, the definition of untrusted is anything you don't have control over, type of thing. So that could be on a partner's land. That could be, if you're a shared tenant in a building and you have, cardholder data onto that, that could also be included in that if you don't have your own circuit, type of thing. So.
Okay, great. All right, done with that. I heard the proposed PCI DSS v4 will be incorporating some of the DESV requirements. Is this true? And if so, in what ways? DESV looks like it would require a lot of resources.
Yeah, so there's about 80-ish extra controls within DES. And if people in the call, that's basically the kind of naughty list of PCI. So you've mishandled cardholder data somehow, so then your bank would say you now need to be under the DES for 1, 2, 3 years after that. And it adds a number of different things. The biggest thing with DES is that it incorporates checks upon checks, type of thing. So they have a number of different controls that say, great, you did a pen test, now validate, that you're doing this on an annual basis, like just a kind of a check on a check, type of thing. But there are some requirements that are over and above with that. One of it being DLP, data loss prevention, that looks like it will be incorporated within 4.0, type of thing. So they had some of that stuff incorporated into the draft. Who knows whether it will be in the final, type of thing. But that's one of the things that they did incorporate in at least the initial draft of it. So,
okay, great. What are the requirements to become an ISA?
I'd have to double check. Obviously, you have to be with a company that has to deal with PCI, pay some money to the PCI Council, and take a training. It's actually basically the same training as a QSA type of thing that you go through. It's like a day and a half of presentation and tests at the end. There is no certification requirements. As a QSA, I actually have to maintain a security and an audit one now. And I don't think that's a requirement with the ISAs, but it's all up on their website. They have actually the qualification guide, everything like that they kind of outline. So,
okay, great.
But it's much lower than a QSA. Yeah.
We just threw a few things in the chat, and I actually just redid it, so you have it twice. So some of the other links, if you're looking forward to those. Does Microsoft Windows Defender meet the AV requirements?
So it can, yes.
When can't it?
So, I mean, again, this is the same thing with like Carbon Black, really what we're looking at for the controls perspective, whether it's meeting each one of those requirements in requirement 5. So, we have certified people using Windows Defender as an AV component. I think the biggest issue, and I'd have to go back and double look, but there's right now PCI requires a scan, type of thing, and Defender is more active. But there are things that we've referenced off of Microsoft that maps to PCI that kind of close that loop onto that there type of thing.
Here's an interesting one. From an organizational and operations perspective, what would you recommend in terms of PCI compliance related staffing? For a small company that is growing their PCI scope, would you recommend a single compliance manager? Do you have any advice for trying to incorporate these new skills into teams?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always a pronged approach to this. So there are a number of controls that will have to be performed by system administrators. So a great example is like security baselines. Like you can help craft it, you can help look at it from the implementation standpoint. But every new system that comes up has to have these standards onto it, type of thing. And it's not going to be a compliance person actually applying those, So it's always a team effort of secure coding standards. You're not going to be the one coding, but you're trying to make sure that security is enveloped into the entire pipeline, with that. So definitely working with that. But whether you need a full-time compliance person, most of the time I'd say no if you're a small team type of thing. Really, it's those kind of checks all the way through the year to ensure that you're doing all the necessary tasks. I've seen a lot of great implementations where they'll take, if they're a Atlassian shop, they'll do Jira or Service Desk, and they'll do reoccurring tickets, based on all the activities that they have to do through PCI, and it's distributed to the right team. So they'll distribute and say, hey, head of IT, you need to schedule a pen test once a year, over this and assign a ticket, and that gets tracked, type of thing. If these due dates, these tickets go late, somebody sees it, hopefully speaks up, and that's typically somewhere at the management layer type of thing. We've worked with teams as well under our virtual CISO offering to kind of help out with that, to oversee that and kind of act as that guidance and oversight activity, which has worked really well with small teams. Where you kind of bleed the line is like we work with a number of small like fintech, and it seems like they get hit the hardest, especially in the service provider area, where they're touching cardholder data. And sometimes, like I'm working with one client now that before they could even release their product into the marketplace, the bank, because they're partnering with some banks, mandated that they get PCI compliant. So we had to actually certify them into a test like mimicked environment of what it would be, but the bank wouldn't allow them to use real cardholder data until they got that certification, type of thing. Those are the hardest hit, because they're 20 people, 30 people, and it's just, it's hard to justify an FTE, with that. And that's why a lot of times, like, we'll augment a lot of their things. And it really depends on how much oversight you have with it. So if you have somebody very detail oriented and can outline all those tasks within a task tracker and reach out to us when they just need those expert or pointed assessments, that can work. Sometimes people, they're just moving so fast that they don't have time to look back and say whether this fits within PCI and all that stuff. That's where we take a more active role into it, type of thing. But yeah.
Gotcha. I think a couple of comments. I believe your company needs to be a participating organization before you can be an ISA. I don't know if that's true.
Okay.
That's some answered. ISAs test annually, so I guess that's done. Our as QSA must retest annually. Everyone's typing that answer in, so I guess that's I guess that must be pretty accurate. Okay.
Yeah, ISAs and QA. I think everybody in the I think P2P QSAs. I don't know if they have to test annually. But yeah, ISAs and QSAs, once you go to the training, the on-site training, it's basically a web test, type of thing. We have to log in every year and go through PowerPoint presentation and double check all the questions.
Another one that might be tough. As a QSA, how would you scope an AS400 IBM-I with multiple LPARs, where some LPARs process and transmit cardholder data, but do not store cardholder data?
Gotcha. So
how would you scope that?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple aspects to that. So the logical partitions that are in that, obviously those LPARs are absolutely in there. Oftentimes they have a separate storage area. And then the question also comes down to where they get their authentication from. So whether they're using, I don't know, with AS400, like top secret or things of that nature to actually handle authentication into that there. And then one of the big things that it hasn't been an issue for a while, but obviously the authentication into that. So the admin access should be encrypted. back in the day, it was all telnet, you know, into the mainframe. So a lot of people are using nowadays secure telnet, which is basically like a web front end to plugging into the mainframe. So those are multiple aspects, and then getting access and user roles. So who can see cardholder data, where those, you know, batch files stored or whatever the cardholder data is, where is that actually being stored, you know, but temporarily it said it was only transmitted, you know, but there's probably some type of, you know, either quick storage or some type of, whether it's just in memory, then we don't have to worry about that, but outlining all those aspects and then going from there and gathering the evidence to it. So
Find out a bit. In regards, maybe back to the cloud, in regards to primarily AWS environments, does TrustedSec have any hot tips, known challenges, or best practices? The differences seem to be vast compared to more traditional infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is knowing how your application plays in each of the services. And like I mentioned before, that shared responsibility matrix, understanding where the controls are actually owned. If we're talking about just like implementing like PCI in an AWS environment, AWS has a lot of good information. They even have stuff pointed directly to AWS, even to the point I think they even have something that you can fire up an environment that is PCI compliant, you know, type of thing. Like it's actually geared for PCI. So they set up your VPCs, you set up network access, and the traditional like 3-tier, you know, presentation, the middle logical, and the data store area, using that, that they'll actually spin up all those services for you right out of the bat. Now, the question comes down to how are you implementing your application into the cloud? You know, if people are moving from a traditional like thick client, sometimes they'll just spin up some VMs, and that's EC2, and you have to apply baselines on, you know, whether you're using, you know, some type of Linux flavor or Windows or whatever that may be, and then getting those permissions right all the way through it. But then, you know, sometimes they'll actually do it a step further and they'll containerize somehow. So whether you're using Docker or Kubernetes, and there are configuration things that, you know, CIS has a lot of good baselines on doing like your Docker file and what configurations you can have with that. There's also good linters out there that will actually check your configurations, making sure you don't have blaringly, you know, security issues within there. Those are good to incorporate into your pipeline, your CI pipeline, you know, type of thing. There's a ton of stuff we could go over. In fact, we just did a presentation on that. So
right, exactly. As you're saying, and it's in the comments if you want to take a look.
Yeah, but if you're I mean, honestly, whoever gave the question, I would say if you're in the planning phase with that, you know, have a conversation with us. We'd be glad to, you know, go through and kind of point out some of the documentation. If you're looking for us to take a more active role, you know, we'd be happy to do that, and we've done that with clients as well. So
great. Okay, in a controlled environment with a black box vendor solution which resides in network and accepts card payments, is there a requirement to use those workstations only for that service, or could they be used for general work, email, HIPAA data, etc.?
So black box, are they talking about
solution?
Okay.
In network and accepts card payments.
So, I mean, if it's a black box solution, they need to be a service provider, you know, type of thing. So you might not have any control into like some type of appliance type of thing, but you would still have to, if they can impact security or touch card order data, they need to be incorporated within your PCI program, measuring them at least once a year.
So maybe they're saying a black box program within the cardholder data environment.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah. So again, it comes down to the qualifications of a service provider is whether they directly touch cardholder data or they can impact the security to the cardholder data environment, you know, type of thing. So that would be the first thing on the black box. Now, on the question of, you know, let's say we're doing a virtual terminal and, you know, it's a PC that I'm going up to Chase Bank or First Data, and I'm typing in the cardholder data from a payment I just got over the phone or a fax or whatever that may be. Could I also do email, web, that type of thing as well? You can. All the controls obviously apply to that, and that PC is also considered cardholder data environment, which means it spreads scope, you know, type of thing. So a lot of people like to move that off. In fact, if you actually do SAQ-CVT for virtual terminal, which is basically typing in cardholder data over a terminal, a payment portal.
Mm-hmm.
That it actually requires as some of the prerequisites that you isolate that PC from the rest of the network, type of thing. But in the case where you're using like your desktop, you got to be cautious on scoping. What I generally recommend is if you're trying to implement scope onto that, obviously getting ACLs down to inbound outbound to what's business justified, but also from a web perspective, I strongly recommend DLP, which will be required now, type of thing. But as long as you go down to business justified, you should be fine. So, yeah.
Are there any controls that are within PCI that you wouldn't recommend for the business, and vice versa? Anything that, a lot of times we're always saying reduce the scope, reduce the scope, get everything as small as possible. Anything that wouldn't make sense or is more onerous that you typically wouldn't do outside of that environment if you had both roles?
Yeah, I mean, PCI, from a control framework perspective, they hit a lot of the common points. I don't think they typically go overboard, on some of the stuff, and, dealing with this a lot with the framework, like you understand where the controls are coming from. And honestly, compared to like an 853 type of thing, PCI goes way less, than that in a lot of the different controls. It's 853 is way more heavy on the documentation and the processes and everything like that. They are like, I honestly, for a lot of this stuff, recommend to go more, type of thing. A great example is, they only require businesses to do a vulnerability scan every quarter, type of thing. That's way too few. You have to fix critical vulnerabilities within 30 days. If it's truly, and we have this conversation a lot with clients, if it's truly critical, it's days, it should be days, type of thing. But that you should reserve that for the few and far between, type of thing. So for example, there's new, SMB wormable, Microsoft thing that's, supposedly coming, in the next patch cycle or whenever it does, that could be critical, depending on your judgment on your critical ratings, and then fit into that time frame, type of thing. But yeah, we typically recommend that you should be hitting most assets at least weekly, from a scan. Some clients will even do daily from the external, all that stuff and everything. So.
What is the difference between reduced attestation questionnaires and compliance? For example, with SAQA, there was no penetration testing requirement. Does that mean I do not have to perform one?
Yep. So that's a great question. We get that a lot, type of thing. Basically, this is kind of, it came out of the Visa, how they kind of helped to reduce a lot of these merchants. Right now, actually on the books, they require every single merchant. This is Visa. They require every single merchant to actually attest to PCI unless you're using like a P2P solution, type of thing. Now in practice, they all go through measurements of the bank. So like for their attestation process, that's not always applied. They're still judging per their levels, type of thing. So if you're level 3, level 4, you're probably not even being asked, for it. And there's a difference between your attestation and what you're agreeing to. So that's a big thing. So when you sign up for a merchant account to process Visa, MasterCard, or sign up directly with Amex or Discover, you're agreeing to the terms and conditions of PCI, that you'll follow those, the security standards laid out by the card brands and everything like that. That's an agreement you do. Whether you attest to that or not is totally separate. And that's where they kind of break out those levels. And it's up to basically the banks measure their own merchants on their compliance. So the more transactions you have each year will force you up to higher levels, which require more validation that you're doing those requirements with that.
But you're expected to do them all.
So you are expected, type of thing, more or less. So the scenario here is like, if you answer correctly on an SAQA, let's just say you fully outsource everything. So you're not doing a penetration test, you're not doing vulnerability scans, but there is still an asset that is on your network that you're forwarding, like going through a shopping cart where you go into that payment page, you're going to authorize.net, you're going to PayPal, whatever that payment processor that you're fully outsourcing to through an iframe or full redirect. Well, what if somebody compromises that site there, compromise it, redirects to a site that they own, they spoof PayPal, type of thing. And all of a sudden it looks like PayPal. I just came from your site. I'm typing in my cardholder data.
Right.
You will still be, depending on how big the breach is, you'll still answer to the card brands, get on the phone with them, and they could most likely require you to hire a PFI, a PCI forensics investigator.
Right.
They'll go through the full DSS to measure you. They won't do SAQA. They'll go through the full DSS to see where you're in compliance, where you're not in compliance, and then outline, what cardholder data was compromised during that time, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very, PCI is largely a CYA, type of thing. It's trying to stay ahead of federal regulators, trying to do a little bit of brand protection. But some of the presidents of PCI Council, even before any data is out on a breach, they have just admitted they weren't PCI compliant, type of thing. So they look at it, I would say, more as obviously you weren't following the rules, so you got breached, type of thing. And most of the case, it's probably true, type of thing. But still, you're out of compliance for one requirement, you were non-compliant, as their dictation comes down to.
Right. So. All right, cool. We only have a couple minutes left. So get any last questions in, and then we'll see. Bank has a solution they say is end-to-end encrypted. I don't see it on P2P list. Right. Can I still use this solution? How does this affect my compliance?
Yep. Yeah, so there's a lot of solutions out there that aren't PCI certified from a P2P perspective. The actual PCI guidance is that you should or the bank should get a independent review of that. And I forget the acronym. It's like NASB or it's like non-certified solution certification. Basically, a P2P person would do that, not going through the certification, would basically certify it to PCI, but it's a standalone assessment that somebody should get that. Now, in practice, that doesn't happen, type of thing, because there's no carrot or stick for those assessments to actually take place and everything. So what we see oftentimes on the payment gateways and the big payment processors, they will have solutions that they say is end-to-end, but they're also the same people that are measuring your compliance. So if you have a conversation with them, you could use the P2PE if they say, yes, go ahead and use the P2PE, type of thing. It comes back to the question of who's responsible for your compliance. As long as you get it in writing and they're okay with it, using an end-to-end solution, and even though it's not listed, you say, okay, yep, this is, the bank said it was okay, so I can use it, then you can use it, type of thing. Other than that, you're going to either to a BIP, which is, IP-based swipe terminals, type of thing, which still have to be PTS certified for the terminal itself, or some other means, type of thing. So there are alternates that would be more questionnaires, but you wouldn't be able to use a P2P if you don't get absolute blessing on that. So. Okay,
great. And last question to finish it up. What are the most common challenges you see with compliance that customers have, things you have to go back to the most? What's the, maybe the one or two biggest things that you see recurring?
Yeah, the biggest stuff that we see reoccurring when we go into, especially like repeat customers, and we'll especially see it after we do a new customer, and get them, it takes a little bit to get them to the PCI goal line. But the biggest thing that slips after that is usually the reoccurring manual tasks that need to be done. So we're talking about a risk assessment, reviewing their policies, doing security awareness training, things that actually take somebody doing it. When we come back up on site, we're saying, okay, when were the last time these policies were reviewed? And we're looking and say, oh yeah, it was the last time from last year, type of thing. Right. Those are the biggest things that slip, that they just didn't assign somebody. Like, everybody was project focused at the beginning, but nobody was assigned to take it from ongoing, business. So oftentimes we'll rework with them to say, okay, guys, here's what needs to be in place and all that stuff. Who should be assigned to this? So when we go through this, when we mention PCI's point in time, we'll ask for, how are you going to prevent this from happening in the future? Like, okay, I get it. You missed a scan, or you didn't do something with that. Okay, that's fine. give me root cause and how you're going to prevent it in the future. And oftentimes we'll put that right in the rock, you know.
So would you still then recommend a pre-assessment annually or?
No, I mean, it depends on how much the environment has changed, you know, like doing a pre-assessment every single year and an assessment every single year is, a lot of times is double work, you know, with that. But if there's like big changes, like you're going from a monolithic application internally and you're going all up to AWS, hey, maybe it'd be prudent to actually, let's see if all those PCI controls that you put here in the Rex, everything translate over to PCI, and you have monitoring, logging, you know, IPS, IDS, you know, all that stuff is shifted over to a cloud provider. Or if you're doing a new business model, or oftentimes we'll get called into pre-assessments of new mergers and acquisitions. So, hey, I just bought a new hospital, you know, we're a hospital chain. I just bought a new hospital. They have their own parking, their, you know, vending machines, all that stuff. We need to know, you know, before we bring them onto our official PCI compliance, that they're all good, or they're on their own and they have non-compliance issues that we have to work through, you know, with the bank and everything, type of thing. So, yeah.
All right. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
A jam-packed hour, I'll tell you that much. Got a lot out of it. And thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. If there's anything else you had questions on or anything you'd like us to continue on the discussion, of course, feel free to call. We have this recorded. It will be on our website under the events for the Ask Me Anything. And we would love to have your comments back to see if we should do more of these, or there's different topics that you'd like to have and Ask Me Anything. So once again, Justin, thanks so much.
Yeah,
really appreciate
pleasure.
it. It's fantastic. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.